Welcome everyone to Workforce Wednesday. Today our topic is workforce prep for lower level students. Our presenter is Christopher Sheffield, and he is an AEL career pathway. He's in AEL Career Pathways with Birdville ISD. Today's October the 17th, Workforce Wednesday, and I am your host and moderator, Olga Escamilla. So welcome. I'm so glad to have y'all on. Thank you for joining us. So we'd like to give a big presenter welcome to Christopher Sheffield. Christopher has been with Birdville Adult Education for 4 years. He's the Career Pathway Navigator as well as the Intensive Course and Curriculum Specialist. He has a MA in Linguistics and a TESOL certification, and his background is teaching lower level ESL. So welcome, Christopher. If you have any questions right now, please let us know. But you're going to see either this slide, a question slide, or Christopher has questions built into the presentation, and we'd really like for y'all to participate. Okay, Christopher, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Sheffield with Birdville ISD. I want to thank Dr. Escamilla for inviting me to give this presentation. So, like we mentioned before, workforce preparation for lower level learners. That's my contact information down there, christopher.sheffield@birdvilleschools.net. I'll have it again at the end if you need to see it. So I want to give a little bit of motivation for why I wanted to do this presentation. So last year I was working as a teacher for some basic level classes, and I also started working as a CPN. I was a little discouraged when I started to learn more about the policy and guidance that we wanted for our students. I was a little overwhelmed by what leadership was asking of the students, and I kind of placed a higher priority on my students' short-term goals than their long-term ones. So I saw all the stuff that we needed to do for workforce preparation, but I was very focused on things like, if the students aren't getting that past tense every time, we might not need to move on. But then I kind of realized what the guidance could offer, and I realized that all I had to do was meet my students where they are, where they were, and we could build from there to get where we wanted to go. So just starting off, I have one question here. So what are your motivations for being part of this presentation? What do you want to know more about? I'll take some notes and I'll try to hit on those as we go along. And hopefully if there's anything specific, I can come back to that as we move forward. I'm watching the chat box here, retention. Yeah, retention is a key. I'll make a note of that. So I think one of the big things about workforce preparation activities is it kind of highlights what our end goal is, starting with lower level learners. I see that. We'll talk about that the whole time.
Christopher, if you could read the comments because it went.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I saw that Mauro said some motivation techniques that I use to lead to more student retention. I think we have some in there. What reading levels are considered lower levels? We'll hit on that too with a couple definitions that we have. Okay, I'm going to underline retention and infuse that a little bit as we go forward. I think the biggest thing to think about in terms of retention as we move on to this next one and we get into the heart of it is by highlighting these end goals, even starting with lower level learners, we can kind of put that gold star on where we're heading to, and that can kind of help with that retention. So moving on, I want to kind of talk about a little bit of some fundamentals for accepting workforce preparation activities. So first of all, workforce preparation activities aren't an overhaul of everything that we know about adult education. Oftentimes, workforce preparation activities aren't just piling on additional requirements, but they're changing or enhancing many of the things that we already do. So I mentioned this before reading some of the chat comments, but these kinds of activities allow us to keep outcome in mind while balancing them with our needs of our students, maybe some of the basic skills needs. Okay, so we're going to start off with a couple definitions. So are you familiar with what the workforce preparation activities are defined as in policy and guidance? So Mark says no. I was in the same boat when I first started this building some classes, especially IETs. Cool, we have some yeses. So I think pretty mixed bunch. There are a couple policy letters that I'll reference throughout that'll kind of point you there in some definition lists we'll see. Okay, so workforce preparation activities are defined in policy and guidance. On the next slide here, we'll see what those are. So it says workforce preparation activities are encompassing activities, programs, or services designed to help an individual acquire a combination of basic skills, critical thinking, digital literacy, self-management, and then it points out some competencies here. And these are the ones we're going to focus on today. Using resources, using information, working with others, understanding systems, skills necessary for successful transition into completion of post-secondary education, training, or employment, and other employability skills that increase an individual's preparation for the workforce. I see from Mark, he says, I've been in the business of AEL for 20 years and these activities have never been made clear via workforce. Hopefully here we can back these up a little bit. So I will say there's a lot of leeway and flexibility with how we can kind of interpret these and how we can kind of move forward with implementing them into the classroom. So just a little roadmap of where we're going to head from here. I'll show you how we get started in our program with integrating the various activities in adult education. Then we'll compare workforce activities with AEL and adult education. Then we'll go through each of the listed workforce preparation activities and talk about some specific ways to build them into a class. So this is our standard lesson plan template that we use at Birdville. And the checkboxes that we see here allow us to cross-reference adult education literacy activities, workforce preparation activities, as well as workforce training types and lesson elements. So this is a good place where we start when building a lesson to kind of make sure that we're hitting each of the spots and seeing where things kind of cross over and feed into one another. So some definitions for our basic skills activities in adult education. So adult basic education activities are those with competencies equivalent to the end of 8th grade. So when we're talking about reading levels for workforce preparation or for basic skills, that's kind of our marker there. Here, as mentioned, some content. So instruction includes reading, mathematics, communication skills, social studies, physical sciences, health, digital literacy, and then career and college readiness competencies. This differs a little bit from what we have defined as adult education. This is a little more broad and talks about kind of all the programs that we can offer. So academic instruction, which increases an individual's ability to read, write, and speak in English, and perform mathematics or other activities necessary for attainment of secondary school diploma or its equivalent, transition to post-secondary education and training, and to obtain employment. So what I want to kind of do is see here what we have for the adult ed activities, and then we'll kind of compare those with workforce preparation. So, quick question here. How might you summarize basic skills or adult education content in a more concise list? So, because of that, because we have lots of definition going on, one thing we tried to do when building this is making a more kind of concise list of what those activities may be. So this is our list here. So for adult education literacy, we have literacy, speaking, listening, cooperation, digital literacy, math and numeracy, and reasoning. So I kind of tried to reduce all of those things in the definitions down to a couple here, and then we have those workforce preparation activities that we talked about. Some you'll see feed into one another and kind of focus on some of the same tasks like cooperation and working with others. And you might notice that often a given activity may fall under an AEL activity and a workforce preparation activity at the same time. So the content may be AEL-based, and the methods used in activity may often be workforce preparation aligned. So something to think about when using this, and this kind of hits on Mark's question. He says, would this be instructing with contextualizing each subject? This is our IET template, so all of these activities would be contextualized for that. We want everything to be kind of linked together. One thing to note is I had a GED teacher kind of come up to me when we first introduced this and said, where's my spot for history and science? And interpreting that and using this for our purposes, we kind of came to the conclusion that science is usually contextualized math and history is often contextualized literacy. So we can feed it under the other tab, or we can kind of look at it that way so that we can kind of see it in a more general way to cross over and check off our different activities. So we're going to move forward to the workforce preparation activities in particular. So, exploring workforce preparation activities in detail. So, each workforce preparation activity of those 6 that we had listed will have 2 slides more or less, unless I need to have an example there. On that first slide, I'll kind of talk about my interpretation of what that definition is or what that activity is. Then I'll talk about what we're doing in adult ed already that may satisfy those needs. And then I'll talk about how we may see this in college and career. So our first workforce preparation activity is using resources. So my interpretation is requiring the deliberate and active use of resources. This develops autonomy for our students. So in adult ed currently, we tend to use lots of reasoning and critical thinking as a part of our basic skills, but we often forget the practicality of going directly to an informed source for help. I know for myself, being raised on the communicative method of teaching, I'll often tell students, don't look it up, you don't have to Google it, let's talk through it until we understand it. When we think about workforce preparation activities and using resources, we might want to look at activities that kind of spell things out as a reference rather than always talking through it. And it may be just something to supplement what we're doing or to add something a little different. In the next slide, I'm talking about some specific activities that I've used in my class and you could use in yours. So generally look at and use authentic policy and procedure guides. These are resources that may already be available for your students or they may already need. To get started, you could go over key terms before you pass out the material, or in the material, simplify the terms, or maybe even watch a video of the process that you'll be investigating to kind of give students a better idea. So things you could look at are step-by-step processes for maybe completing a transaction, such as those as for a hotel desk clerk who's checking someone in or a cashier. I found a couple really good resources online where it kind of goes through the steps to it. What do you do first? What do you do next? What do you do after that? Looking at that resource and seeing what you're supposed to do is a good way to find a resource that could be helpful in the workforce and kind of already get adjusted to using that. Another activity that this could align with is outlining procedures in class. So maybe, what do we do to start the class? What do we do to finish the class? Get a couple of those procedures. I think 5 steps would be great. Then ask students questions that would require them to refer back to the materials. If you come up with one procedure with about 5 questions, students may remember it. But if you have a couple different procedures and ask questions, what happens after you do this? Students would probably have to refer back to the resource, and that would kind of get this workforce preparation activity fulfilled. Another thing you could do is use procedures from the student handbook. So the only procedure that we have outlined in our student handbook is the grievance policy, which is good for students to know, but it may not be something that, well, we hope it's not something that they have to reference too often. So that kind of exemplifies the fact that, for all of these workforce preparation activities, we want them to be relevant and meaningful. We had a question about contextualization. So if we are doing something like differentiated learning or we're building an IET, making sure that the procedures or the resources that the students would be investigating are tied into what they need would be really key to this. In this slide, I'm talking a little bit about context. So for these activities, we could fit these into lessons about sequencing words or comparing the simple present with the continuous. What does this person normally do? What's she doing now if we're watching a video? Or if we're writing a how-to when we want to hit those benchmarks about writing in different styles. So before we leave this, I have a quick question here. Are there any kind of resources your students might need to practice using? I know for our IET classes, we're starting a phlebotomy class, maybe lab tests or requisition forms might be helpful for us to look at. For our lower level students, even getting them started with a handbook and kind of going through it may be a good resource to start with. Let me go ahead and jump to the next one.
Christopher, Michelle had a question. She said, what activities are out there for CNA?
Oh, I missed that. Yeah, what activities are out there for CNA to be contextualized with? So a lot of those are really good health activities. One of the best that I've seen, and I'll kind of hit on this a little bit later, especially with using systems, is with things like chain of command. So I think this is a few slides away, but that's a really good one. So it's very important that CNAs and everyone in the healthcare field kind of follow that chain of command. And that's a really good way to practice using these workforce preparation activities, making sure that we know the order of things, why things work, and how. And there's some good suggestions there. One from Mark, lots of tutorials for visual students, interactives online for CNAs. So there's stuff out there. It does maybe take some modifying to do, but there's some good material there. As for using resources, any kind of handbooks might be really helpful for them to be able to reference for that. Using information, which is the next one, I think is something that we could use for IETs depending on how much knowledge they already have. So starting with this one, my interpretation of using information is applying skills and knowledge which students have and to which they have access. So what we're currently doing, we often structure our lessons in AAL such that we introduce a topic and explain it, then apply it in practice. We see the use of information activities where students are given information, then asked about it. And using information is often related to critical thinking exercises. We give the information, and then we ask questions, and they have to use that information to find those solutions. For situations where we see the use of information in work, day-to-day activities, special assignments, when adjusting to changes, students kind of have to activate their prior knowledge to make that solution and to make a decision. So some activities I have outlined here. So students can solve problems based on given information. As a note here for my first bullet point, kind of think of this critical thinking piece here. Because these activities can sometimes be tedious to students who don't have a lot of experience with them, let them know what to expect before the activity gets started. Some ways to implement this is present students with a narrative detailing a problem or a person is having on the job, and ask the students for advice. Given what they know, what does the character need to do? Right? So you give them the information of what's going on, and then you use the information that they already have to try to solve the problem, or to try to give some advice there. Another situation that another activity we could kind of implement is discuss a peculiar problem a student has faced at work and how they overcame it. So in this situation, the student is giving you the background, and they're also giving you a history of the information that they use to solve the problem. The last one here, and I have an example coming up, is students work through an information tangle. So I'll show you an example of what I mean by that. It's kind of like an information gap, but all of the students have the same gaps, and they have to use the information provided to kind of solve that. Relatedly, algebraic comparisons or word problems are really good for this. So something like, Sam is 5 years older than Sally. How old is Mark if he's 3 years older than, those things are kind of complicated. They have all the information in the problem already, and then they have to use critical thinking and the information that they have to find the solution. Here's an example of that information tangle I was talking about. So the full details of the character are dependent on information provided by one or multiple other characters. Students are then asked questions which require them to reference multiple descriptions. I think this kind of comes back to retention a little bit, because this is fun for students if they're all comfortable and it's a reasonable amount of rigor. It mixes things up a little bit, gets them talking to one another and really solving problems here. So just to talk through this a little bit, so I have it color-coded. So we see in the first quadrant, Henry McCowan. He's 3 years older than Mark. Then we go to Mark, and it says he was born in 1974. Then there might be a question that says, how old is Henry? So we have these interdependent sets of information that we have to look at to solve the problem. Some context that this might fit into. So with examples above, we can fit this lesson in when we're talking about comparisons. So if we're using ER words, or we're saying even as would be helpful. Algebraic expressions if we're looking from an HSC perspective, or giving advice. I know oftentimes giving advice is taught at a higher level, especially for a higher level for our ESL students. But giving advice here, we can think of someone needs to do this or has to do this, and that could satisfy that giving advice while also using information there. So before we leave, if there's any answers for this one, how might you better distinguish using resources from using information? I know they're closely related. Do you have a suggestion for how they might be different? Oh, Mark points out virtualnerd.com for verbal comprehension in math, especially multiple function problems. Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting resource. My interpretation of the difference between using resources and using information: using resources going to the information because you don't have it. Using information is solving a problem when you have the information already. But they're definitely closely related here. We can go ahead and move on to the next workforce preparation activity, and this is working with others. So this prepares students for operating in a team-based setting, learning how to utilize the strengths of themselves and others. I think in AL activities, this is seen in group or team-based work, and I think we used a lot and we like it and it's really helpful, but we sometimes fall short in making sure that collaboration is actually happening. So sometimes we'll break our students into groups and they'll all be sitting at tables together but working independently. To make sure that we're satisfying this workforce preparation activity, we have to have that collaboration going on. So places that we might see this: daily operations in organizations, working in structured systems, group projects. I think it's pretty standard that we can expect this. I think the thing that we struggle with in AEL is oftentimes making sure that's actually happening. So just reading the chat box here, I see some responses. So the problem with it sometimes with information is students that are lower level have limited skill sets in parts of speech. Mark said that, and that's true, and I think being able to guide them is really helpful for that. And it says more advanced students helping those struggling with literacy. Yeah, so working with others, that's definitely one of those there. If we have a multi-level classroom, that's a really great way to utilize that thing that can often be a challenge. So for some activities that I have here, so a team-based activity with group decision-making. I think the group decision-making is the part that ensures that we have collaboration going on. So starting off, students should be comfortable with one another and be knowledgeable enough about the material to not feel intimidated. So this might not be something you want to start with day one. Students can often be shy, especially in lower levels. So you want them to be more comfortable. So one particular activity: students can work collaboratively to build a schedule for a hypothetical store. I know this sounds complicated, as if they're managers. Maybe include weight information for added rigor. So say you give students a project where they have 5 employees and they need to staff the store every day with 3 shifts. To add in the rigor, we can include wages. You can only spend this much money. All of your employees make this much an hour. And we can also do things like, so-and-so can't work on these days. So-and-so only works these days. And that's a good way to throw in some of those curveballs and have those group decision-making skills happening, having everyone work together. I think the hardest part about this activity would be not so much the language part, but expressing how you're working through that. So having some guidance there would be helpful. Something that I've tried in my classroom to kind of do a working for others, which helped me out in lots of ways, was to make an activity out of planning a potluck. So my students are always big fans of having potlucks around holidays. Every holiday that we can have one. My students have tried to make one. In the beginning, I thought, okay, we're going to make a list, we're going to do it. And then after that, I decided, you're going to make a list, you're going to do it. So we can make this decision-making thing for our potlucks into a workforce preparation activity that gets students to tiptoe into the direction of using this. So all caps from Mark, excellent icebreaker potluck. I agree. It takes a lot of weight off the teacher in terms of, okay, the students want to have a party, what do we do? And it makes that planning into an activity. I was also excited about it, sorry. So we can include restrictions that students collaborate, so students have to collaborate to reach a decision. So instead of just passing around the list, maybe if you had a potluck to start off the first month, and you're going to have one for October for Halloween, since it's the middle of October for us now, you can say, this student can't bring this, no one can bring anything that they brought last time. What I've seen often is students will really want certain things. If you tell them they can't bring the same thing they want last time, then they have to find someone else who can bring it. I think that's really helpful. It gets people talking, and students love a good potluck. So context where this could be helpful. So question words is a really good place. Who, what, where, when, kind of getting all those questions for this, whether that's for the potluck activity or if you're able to build it into that scheduling activity. Can and can't is good when we build in the rigor. This person can't do this. This person can bring this. Pronouns as well when we're talking about he and she and they are doing things. If we go back to the first activity about the scheduling, math for time or balancing a budget, I think we have a benchmark in HSE for financial literacy. I think if I'm right or wrong, someone will tell me in the chat box. And one quick question here to end this activity. In what classes do we need more activities featuring these kinds of activities? And I'll break that down a little bit. So often in the ESL classroom, we'll have some group work. Sometimes because we have short-term and very specific goals in the HSE classroom, we often don't see so much group work or working with others. Is that a problem some of you have seen? Are there solutions that you have? IT transition. Right, I think working with one another, especially in ITs, is good. Sometimes students can be so focused on training and the theory part of the IT that we forget about having that collaboration going on there. Group work promotes conversation, definitely. Practicing pronunciation in scripted situations, good. Yeah, very rare in GED classrooms. That's been my experience as well. But I think, yes, the financial literacy from Risa, thank you. So we often talk about multi-level classrooms in our ESL, on the ESL side, but we also have multi-level classrooms on the HSE side. So maybe if we could build in a time in our classrooms to have people at different levels help one another out, that may be a very simple way to step up the working with others in the HSE classroom. And we have a note from Sharon here in the chat box. You can get financial literacy info from your local workforce center. Also, some have an employee who can come out to speak with your classes. That might be a good introduction to doing this working with others activity if you did want to go to the activity for balancing a budget or scheduling people. Someone could come out and tell them about the kind of jobs that they have and how they move from those. I clicked a little early here, sorry. So the next workforce preparation activity is understanding systems. This prepares students to think through complex structures and reason with functions which are interconnected. So understanding systems, only 2 words, but I think it's a little more dense than some of our other ones. For our second bullet point here, I think ways that we often see this already. In ESL, if we explicitly teach grammar or the writing process, we're talking explicitly about systems that students need to understand. For science in the HSE, when we're learning math conventions, this includes thinking about systems. Now the problem is explaining a system and using or understanding a system. How do we make that into an activity? Some places where we will see understanding systems in college and career. So chains of command, this is what I was talking about earlier with the nursing for the CNA. Organizational structure, technical knowledge, governing bodies, and purposes behind processes at work. So we have lots of systems going on all the time. Often in the classrooms, we'll tell the students the ABCs about the system, so we don't spend a lot of time working with the system to understand it. Yeah, and we have a note here in the chat box that says people need to see where they fit in within their work. Definitely. I think that's a really good point when we talk about some of the job training opportunities that we have, like CNA, knowing where you fall into line, what you're accountable for, and what your responsibilities are in that position. So for understanding systems, some activities that we've seen, maybe students explore the structure of something to learn how it works. First and foremost, in terms of preparing for this, we need to find a relevant and meaningful system to analyze. If we're talking about the chain of command for nursing in a general or traditional classroom, that may not motivate our students a lot to really understand it or to dig into it. So finding a good system is important. So for some specifics here, students may learn about the organizational structure in a specific field, or about how the educational system works in the United States, or maybe the duties of those they see when in class. I'm going to focus on the second one that I point out here, how the educational system works in the United States. This is one of our first activities that we do for ESL for Professionals. So at the end of our ESL for Professional course, the students have their documents evaluated. I want to go ahead and let them understand the educational system so that when they send their documents to get evaluated, they're not surprised that their 2 or 3 or 4 year academic experience in their country isn't equivalent to the same thing here. So I think it's very, very important to kind of talk about the different ways that it's structured in the U.S. One way you can kind of tiptoe into this or transition into this more workforce-based activity is maybe start by talking about kinship terms or family trees, right? A family tree is definitely a system that we have, and we can start with your parents, your grandparents, and then we go into where we see lots of systematicity. So when we get those greats, so great grandparent, great, that's one way to kind of introduce the system and then maybe transfer into something a little more workplace oriented. So Mark says, do proportional comparisons of USA educational systems versus their country? Definitely. So that's what we do. So for the ESL for Professionals class, when we talk about the educational system, we say this is the structure in the U.S. We talk about why the structure might be this way, and then we compare it to where some of our students are from and talk about those differences there. And what are the benefits and disadvantages to the system, regardless of how it's organized, or for our system versus another one. And that kind of goes into this last bullet point I have on this slide. It's important to ask questions about the systems to elicit reasoning behind the structure or the benefits. We don't just want to give a system, but we want students to talk about how it works and why. Yeah, and how we see in the chat pod here, how about a doctor's office? This could be important for students new to the country to know the process. Definitely, right? So what's the system? How do I do it? What do I go through? And also, I mentioned in here, I didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, but talking about the people you see in class. So at our main site in the evenings, the student will come in, they pass by the main office, they'll see me, the Career Pathway Navigator, our program coordinator, and then they'll go to the classroom and they'll see their teacher, and in the classroom, a TF might come in. You know, what are these different roles? Who do you need to go to for what, and how do they work together? And that might be a really good way to get started with that. So a place where that might fit into lessons. So if we're talking about conjunctions or transition words, since we're talking about systems, you know, we're talking about multiple different things. So ands or in addition to's. Family terms and titles if we want to start off with that family tree. And preparing students to engage into a specific system. So if we have differentiated learning, instead of trying to find one golden system for the whole class to talk about, we can break the class into career clusters or shared interests, and each of those could find their own system to kind of talk about, and then we could share it and talk about how they work and how they're similar. And Mark said flowcharts. Yeah, flowcharts is, I think, the best way to think about using systems. If you can put it on a flowchart, it's probably a nice system that's worth a nice system that could be really helpful in talking about this. So I think we've had lots of really good activity in the chat pod for this one, but I have this last question for this workforce preparation activity. What systems may students need to explore for your program? Like I said, we've seen some really good ones in the chat pod, but if anyone's waiting to add one in, feel free to do so. Right, from Christina Mason from Workforce Solutions of Tarrant County. She says career clusters with their corresponding career pathways. Best way to add some differentiated learning, I did not read Kelly's response. So Kelly says learning business hierarchy is a great practice, definitely, and that's a good workforce preparation activity, especially for maybe if you're doing an entrepreneurship class. They can compare that to the way the family is set up, definitely have things kind of mixing. And she goes on to say, who is the go-to person for what situations, and describe why this person. What makes one better than the other, or describe characteristics of each person and what makes them the best for their family position. How would this relate to a job or business? Exactly. And I think when we think of our lower level learners, it would often be best to introduce a more relatable topic, something like family terms, and build that up into the business. Right? We have to, like I said at the beginning, meet them where they are and transition to something that may be a little more workforce focused in a way that they're not used to seeing as much, especially in the traditional classes. And it says here, city services, library resources. Definitely. One of our main sites is in a library, and students often have problems knowing which desk do I go to, who's my contact person. So lots of good stuff there. This workforce preparation activity here is skills necessary for successful transition from programs. This is not the most vague of the workforce preparation activities. This is, however, one of my favorite, and I'll get to the actual activity on the next slide. So my interpretation of this is it's a culminating prospect which focuses on meeting an end goal. So whatever those specific skills are, or general skills for a successful transition, I think it's a lot of stuff put into one. So in ESL, our focus on transitioning is growing, and we've definitely been doing more goal setting over the past couple of years. In HSE, we often have short-term goals in mind, and we sometimes neglect preparing students for transition beyond exit. And I think this is where this workforce preparation activity can be really helpful, building students even at the beginning to prepare them to exit towards the end, when they've made the kind of progress that they need. So this is useful for navigating the leap between AEL and the workforce. Students will need specific skills for planning and for making progress. So Christina says in the chat pod, in IT, this can be preparing students on how they can maintain their industry-recognized credential or certification. Definitely. Or knowing what that industry-recognized credential or certification is and how they line up for stackable credentials. So having that knowledge base before making the jump. For lower level learners, this activity is something that we piloted last year that I'm excited to do again this year. So students can complete a career pathways exploration project. So students compile career pathways exploration materials like aptitude tests and interest surveys to build a portfolio. Those are some big words that we don't always see in our traditional classes, but a couple simple searches online and you'll find a variety of aptitude tests and interest surveys at all different levels and intensities that can be helpful for all of our students. So for this activity in particular, I would say it's not something that we do in one day or a week, but we build throughout a couple of weeks. We have a couple instances to kind of put stuff together. For us, we normally start our projects in November. So teachers will get information on what the final goal is, and then they'll build up their students throughout November. And before Thanksgiving, we usually have a presentation at the end. So they can create a presentation which outlines a profession or occupational cluster, why they're interested in it, and how they may enter or continue in the field. If we're having lower level learners start this, they can continue to refine this as they go on and move through the levels. And it's a good way to kind of make those goals, track them, and change them. Starting with lower level learners with this is a really good way to ensure that when they exit, they have the skills that they need. So in terms of actually giving the presentation, we're talking about lower level learners here, so students may be guided with questions which they're prepared to answer, right? So we don't have to think of this as a presentation where we put the student in the front of the classroom, give them 15 minutes and tell them to talk. But having them practice giving a presentation and talking in front of people meets some of our benchmarks, but also is good practice in general. And I think it's okay to guide the students. So we can give the students a list of the questions that we'll ask, and then we can guide them through the presentation asking those questions that they're already prepared with answers. Alternatively, or in addition to, students can research technical skills or terms necessary for a specific job or occupation. They could build this into the presentation or something that they can do throughout the class for that differentiated learning. So we don't want students to leave our program and then enter the workforce and find out that there's a whole glossary of vocabulary words they've never been exposed to. So if we can start off in the beginning giving them those words, I think it'll be really helpful. I'm going to go to the chat pod here and see what comments I've gotten. So instructors can navigate and guide peer-to-peer mentoring. I think that's definitely helpful, especially for skills necessary. One of the benefits of adult ed, on the admin and teacher side as well as the student side, we have people from all walks of life. If we have a classroom full of students, one student probably has a background that can benefit another student whose future might have some similarities for that. Goal setting is exciting, Anna says, for basic ESL students who feel like they have advocates in achieving long-term goals and give you opportunity to work with them to set short-term goals. Learning English can seem so hard. Helps with retention, definitely. Having a way to break down and encourage short-term and long-term goals is a way to keep students in. From a teaching standpoint, it's always good to, a student, we have Monday through Thursday classes. A student misses on Monday and Tuesday. They come Wednesday, they miss Thursday. On Monday, it's a good idea to break out the goals and say, yeah, let's remember why we wanted to start this and kind of build that in and kind of remind them of what they're here for. Mark says, dream to goal chart done via each student at the end of the term. Yeah, I think that's another really good project there and kind of lines them up with this. I'm going to move to the slide that talks about where this might fit within a lesson. So I think this is a good end-of-course project. It may be used to review simple tenses, right? So if we're talking about what we did in the past, what we're doing now, and what we plan for the future, we can cover all of those. And our big three, especially for lower level learners, past, present, future, I think it works really well for this. So sequencing information as well. What are you doing first? What are you doing next? What will you do at the end? And generally a communication activity. This, I think, hits a lot of the benchmarks for our HSE and ESL students, and I think it's a really good opportunity for HSC students to have that interaction that is often missing in our HSE classrooms. And presentation practice. Giving a presentation is a benchmark in, I think, on both sides, HSE and GED. I think for ESL it's on the higher side. So we have one question slide here, and this transitions into the last of the workforce preparation activities. What are some other workforce preparation activities or ideas, either general or specific, that you think are necessary for students? So those listed in policy and guidance are pretty general. I've tried to give some specific activities. Can you think of anything else that might be helpful? If you give me a specific activity, we'll try to align it to one of the 5 we've talked about already, and if it doesn't, we found a new one. So I'll give you a little bit of time on that. I think most things that we can think of in terms of content, especially in our traditional classes, fits within one of those top 5 that we've seen. Videography and or interview done at the end of term. Yeah, I think that might fit into skills necessary for transition, and I think it's something really good to think about though. Simple, we start classes on time at 6 p.m. to emphasize promptness. Yeah, I don't think that fits into any of the other activities that we have listed. Working in group, getting along with others, communication, resume, filling out an application. Yeah, I think some of those are skills necessary for transition. Other of those, getting along, I think it may fall under working with others, but it can sometimes be a beast of its own and something that we miss in some of our courses. Constant conversation. Yeah, I think that's good as well. Constant conversation, making sure students are talking on the ESL side and on the GED side. HSE, excuse me.
Christopher, I like what Christina says. For students that are new to understanding employment, health benefits, paychecks, deductions, safety, retirement, etc., because a lot of students take it for granted that they're going to be having to pay certain kind of taxes. So it's important to let them know what kind of taxes are going to be deducted from their check. So thank you, Christina,
Yes.
for that.
Yeah, Christina Mason has a lot of really good resources. I don't want to throw her out there, but feel free to contact her. She has a lot of really good specific workforce preparation activities. She was kind of my guide when I was getting introduced to this, and she helps mellow out some of my fears for this. And yeah, I think those are, maybe it'll fit under using systems, but making sure students have this by the end of transitioning out or before exit is something that's really helpful. And I don't think it's ever too early to start when we're talking about benefits and paychecks and deductions and all of that. It's complex and dense and might be helpful to start in the beginning. We have another vote from Mark for punctuality and promptness, respecting others' opinions. There are online paychecks via state-by-state calculators, definitely. And it says constant review, referring back to what they learned. Find the info when asked to do the current activity. We have 8 minutes left, and we have about 6 slides. I'm going to go ahead and move on from there, but some really good stuff there. Some that falls within some of the activities we talked about before, and some other stuff that I think stands on its own and deserves some time. Okay? So the next 2 slides include the questions I ask myself for creating workforce preparation activities. So you've kind of seen this format before, and these are the questions that I asked. How does this contribute to being ready for the workforce? So when I think of an activity, the first question I ask is this something that will actually be helpful? And it sounds like an obvious question, but oftentimes we'll look into something, and once we give it some deeper inspection, it's not always necessarily a workforce preparation activity. Maybe it's a good idea, but maybe it doesn't contribute too much to the workforce. The next step that I move to is, what are we currently doing which relates to this or could be extended to include this? And then, are we weak in this area? So do we have to rebuild the will, or do we have enough going on that we can just polish what we're doing already? Then I ask how we currently see this in college and career. Do we see this going on in the real world in college and career? Then we can build from that. Can we use these materials and bring them into the classroom for a workforce preparation activity? These are some of the questions I ask to actually build out that activity. First, I like to start general. What will the students be doing? Right? It doesn't have to get to specifics yet for me. I just kind of like to start general there. Then I think about, what will students need to be prepared for this activity? A good idea to think, should it be in the beginning of the course or at the end of the course? If I'm giving them authentic materials, do I need to define the words before they get it, or will it be at a level that they can understand it? Then I go into, what are the specifics of the activity? What's the 1, 2, 3 of this? I like to build from there with alternatives to either add variety to the activity, make it richer or more rigorous. So in terms of, can I do this once and then maybe do it for a warm-up the next day? And then, can I contextualize it to better fit the needs of the students? Can I contextualize it to an industry or career that they're doing? Can I contextualize it to a unit that we're doing? If our traditional book is talking about the grocery store, can I talk about using systems in a grocery store? I'm sure I can. I mean, it's good to ask that question. And last, how does this activity align with basic skills? How should the activity be sequenced in the scope of the course? We don't want to just throw in a workforce preparation activity to check it off a box. We want to make sure that it makes sense. When things make sense in terms of scope and sequence, students remember it better and they understand it better. On the next slide, I want to talk about some general practices that we can use to infuse workforce skills. So just a couple things that we can start doing from the ground level to build in workforce preparation and kind of change our perspective just a little bit. So we can ask students questions which require some research for using resources. Something that I would change if I was still in the classroom, and I'm going to encourage my students to do, is to maybe use the dictionaries. When we think about a communicative classroom, I said it before, we'll figure it out together. But if you have a word or two of the day, maybe let students use the dictionary, go online to find the translation, so they get in the habit of using that resource and knowing that they can find a resource. And then we can transition that into using it in context or in a communicative activity after we have them practicing with using the resource. Next, ask students to activate prior information before beginning a new topic, or have students share information to build a framework for an activity. And this is a good activity, a good way to start with using information. Instead of starting with giving the information and doing the topic, flip the script a little bit, let the students give you the information they already have, and go from there. That's a pretty good practice for most classes anyway, but thinking about it directly might be a way to start doing it. So discussing how individuals contributed in group work more moves toward working with others. So oftentimes we'll see assigning roles and looking at the final project, but having them be accountable a little bit more might encourage working with others to a degree that might be more helpful for our students. I have a couple things here. Thank you, Mr. Christopher, for the dictionary. Also, online translators from their native language to English. Yeah, normally in my basic and beginning classes, I'm a no dictionary teacher. I prefer to wrench out the definition with communication to get a better understanding. But using resources is something they'd have to do in the workforce, so it's good to go ahead and try that. I'm going to hit on a couple of these little bullet points as we wrap up here. Discussing how individuals contributed to work is something I just said. So understanding system. So if you have students teach back to you or explain how something works after they've seen it, is a really good way not only to understand that they've gotten the information, but also to see them using the system, right? So if we explicitly teach grammar, then we move into some communicative activities. Having that teach back time is a good time to see it in action. Introduce a word of the day for specific occupational clusters. So I think this is a good activity. So maybe you could have a occupational cluster of the week. So for 1 week, we'll give healthcare skills and healthcare words for vocabulary. Then next week, we can move on to a different career cluster. And that way, we're giving them the words and we're giving them the vocabulary, and they can add that to a portfolio without it being overwhelming. And then the last one, Anna says, yes, nouns, conversation, roles. I have a couple of parts of speech here too. So, well, some areas. So spend time on jobs, job titles, locations, where people work, and what they do. So not just the one chapter that we often see on doing jobs. We can talk about it more often. We can bring the subject back to it regardless of where we are in a given textbook. And I think what they do is also an important part. Those verbs and action words that we see for specific jobs, we don't always see when we're doing an industry-specific vocabulary list. Okay? There's some really good stuff in the chat pod. We're running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to move on to the next slide here. So some of the source and resource I used, the definitions were from TCAL. So all the workforce preparation activities and those definitions of adult ed activities and adult basic education, all those are on TCAL. They came from the policy letters, and those definitions came all the way down from WIOA. So some pertinent policy from this from TWC. 0216 change 1, 0416 change 1. Those have been my Bibles while working on infusing workforce preparation activities and also creating IETs, making sure that I'm checking off those boxes and making relevant materials. So I want to say thank you to everybody, and especially thank you to Dr. Escamilla for inviting me to share some of this information. And thank you to everyone in the chat pod.
Thank you so much, Christopher. This was great. A lot of sharing. So if you that are participating have been looking at the chat pod, we've had a lot of sharing, a lot of great ideas from everyone that is participating in the webinar today, and we thank you for that, because this is why we have our Workforce Wednesdays, is for the sharing and for the opportunity to get more ideas. So Christopher, great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you all for participating, because if we don't have your participation, then we don't have Workforce Wednesday. So thank you so much for attending, for being here with us during these hours, and again for just sharing and wanting to move adult ed forward. So thank you, Christopher. Thank you, everybody, for attending.